She was on her back in the dirt on the eastern slope of a mountain she had never been to before, with her right hand locked around a tourniquet on Harlow's thigh and her left hand pointing at a rock face 680 meters away. Not waving, not gesturing, pointing with the flat precision of someone who has already done the calculation and needs the information transmitted once correctly to exactly one person. Briggs was 15 meters to her left, behind a fallen tree, with the Barrett M82A1 braced on its bipod and his eye to the scope. He had the rifle because Drummond had passed it to him during the exfiltration, and Drummond was 30 meters ahead with the hostages and could not get back in time, and there was nobody else. Nobody except her. "Eastern wall," she said. Her voice carried the distance without effort. Not loud, flat and direct the way information travels between people who know how to send it and receive it, above the gap in the rock face. He moved left 20 feet when we came into the open. He's settling now. Harlow made a sound beside her. She did not look down. She pressed harder on the tourniquet windlass and kept her eyes on the eastern wall. "I don't have the angle," Briggs said. "Come up 6 inches on your position. The gap is your reference point." A pause. She heard gravel compress under a boot shift. "Count of 3, she said. Harlow's hand found her forearm. She felt the grip tighten. 1. The Barrett spoke once. The eastern wall went quiet. She looked down at Harlow. His color was wrong in the way that arterial casualties go wrong fast and systemic pale going paler, but the tourniquet was holding. She checked the windlass. She checked his pulse at the wrist. She counted. He was looking at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward. Not gratitude, not relief. Something closer to a man discovering at the worst possible moment that the ground beneath him is more solid than he thought. "Nobody dies today," she told him. He held her gaze. "Okay," he said. She believed him. Briggs's voice came across the open ground quietly, like a man saying something he had not planned to say. "What are you?" She did not answer. 72 hours earlier, she had been a nurse. The Naval Medical Center in Portsmouth, Virginia, sits on the western bank of the Elizabeth River, and at 4 in the morning in early March, the ICU on the 3rd floor is the loneliest place in the building. The hallways hold a particular kind of quiet, not peaceful, not restful, but pressurized. The quiet of machines doing the work that bodies have temporarily stopped doing on their own. Sloan Mercer had worked that floor for 2 years, and she had learned to read it the way some people read weather. There were nights when it meant everything was stable and controlled, and there were nights when it was a held breath, a pause before something broke open. That night was the second kind. She was at the nurse's station when the monitor in room 7 changed pitch. Not an alarm, a variation in rhythm subtle enough that most people would not have registered it at all. The kind of shift that only matters if you have been listening long enough to know what normal sounds like. She was already moving before she had finished processing what she heard. Room 7 held a 61-year-old man admitted 3 days earlier for a cardiac procedure that had gone smoothly. He was supposed to be a straightforward case. Sloan pushed through the door and looked at the readout, and then looked at the man in the bed and made a decision in the following 4 seconds. His lung had collapsed, not from the cardiac procedure directly, from a chain of events that begins with incorrect positioning, progresses through accumulating pressure, and ends with tension pneumothorax, a condition in which air trapped in the chest cavity compresses the heart and the remaining lung until neither can function. It does not wait for a physician to be paged and walk down the hall. Sloan pulled the supply cart to the bedside. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space midclavicular line. She had done this before in her Navy corpsman years, but never in a civilian hospital, and never without a physician present. She did it in 38 seconds. By the time Dr. Calloway appeared in the doorway, still pulling his white coat on, the patient was breathing. The readout had normalized. The crisis had been managed, contained, and resolved in the time it took the attending physician to walk from the elevator to the room. Calloway stood in the doorway and looked at the patient and then looked at Sloan. He read the chart without making her explain it. He set it back down and told her she had done a good job and left the room. Nobody said anything else about it that night, but that was not the incident that got her fired. 3 weeks before that night, a man named Leonard Doyle had died in room 4. He was 53 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Suffolk, Virginia. He had a wife named Patricia who visited every day between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, and who always brought her husband a magazine he never read because the gesture of bringing something mattered more than the content. He was not supposed to die. His condition was serious but manageable, and his prognosis as of the morning of the day he died had been described by Dr. Calloway as controlled and progressing in the right direction. He died at 11:40 in the evening. Sloan had not been on shift. She came in the next morning and found the room empty and the bed stripped, and something wrong in the air that the other nurses were carefully not discussing. She pulled his chart during her lunch break and read it the way she read everything methodically, without skipping anything, without deciding in advance what she was looking for. What she found was a morphine dosage. In the abstract written on paper, it might have seemed like a clerical inconsistency, the kind of thing that gets noted and corrected. But Sloan had been a Navy corpsman for 4 years before she became a civilian nurse, and she had learned that in medicine, as in combat, the small things are the ones that kill you, not the dramatic failures. The quiet ones, the ones that look like rounding issues on paper. The morphine administered to Leonard Doyle on the evening of his death was not within the range prescribed, not by a margin that was trivial. Given his cardiac history and his current medication load, that dosage had significantly suppressed his respiratory function. His heart, which was already working harder than it should have been, had not been able to compensate. He had been given too much, and he had died because of it. Sloan sat in the break room for a long time after reading the chart. She thought about Patricia, who had come in that morning without a magazine. She thought about what her father had told her when she was 12 years old, sitting on the tailgate of his truck on a Friday evening in November, the cold turning their breath visible. The hardest thing, he had said, is not doing the right thing. The hardest thing is doing it when it costs you something. She filed the incident report the following morning. She named the dosage discrepancy. She named the medication. She named the prescribing physician. She named Dr. Calloway. The meeting with the hospital administrator was brief. His name was Hartfield, and he had the manner of a man who had spent 20 years learning to have difficult conversations without actually engaging with their content. He was not unkind. He used phrases like staffing reevaluation and workforce optimization, and at the end of 7 minutes, he slid an envelope across the desk. Sloan picked it up. "The report I filed," she started, "has been received and is being reviewed through the appropriate channels. Leonard Doyle is a matter for the review process, Ms. Mercer. I hope you understand this decision is not a reflection of your clinical competence." He paused. "You are a very skilled nurse." She stood without saying what she thought about the review process or the 7 minutes he had allocated to ending her employment. She took the elevator down to the locker room and stood in front of her locker before opening it. Inside on the top shelf was a photograph taped to the metal wall on her first day. A man in desert utilities squinting into sunlight, one hand raised against the glare, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. He looked like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. Her father, Afghanistan, 2011, 1 year before Helmand Province. She took the photograph down and put it in her bag. She took her stethoscope off the hook, folded it, put it in her bag. She changed out of her scrubs and zipped her bag and left. She drove to her apartment in Chesapeake, which was small and deliberately bare, in the way of someone who had never quite decided if they were staying, and she sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope and read the termination letter. Reason for separation: redundant staffing following departmental restructuring. She read that line 3 times. She folded the letter, put it on the table, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat with it until it was cold. The next morning, she ran 6 miles before the sun was fully up. She had been running before dawn since she was 17 years old, first because her father told her to, and later because the silence of early morning was the one time when her head went quiet in a way that felt earned. She ran along the waterfront, past the naval base perimeter, past the dry docks and the industrial yards, in the long, flat stretch of road that ran parallel to the river. The same route her father had taught her in high school when he was home between deployments, and they would go out together in the dark, her trying to keep up with him never slowing down, but always staying close enough that she didn't fall behind. She had kept up eventually. Around her 19th birthday, she started finishing before him. He never said anything about it, just nodded at her from the end of the driveway like it was the most expected thing in the world. She got back at 6:52, showered, made eggs she barely tasted, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. She wrote down everything she remembered from Leonard Doyle's chart, not because she planned to act on it immediately, because she needed to know it was written somewhere outside her own head. She was on her 3rd page of notes when she heard it. At first, she thought it was a news helicopter. Then the sound got louder and the frequency dropped, and she set her pen down and turned toward the window. The Black Hawk was coming in from the northeast at low altitude, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of something that has already decided where it is going. No markings she could identify, no hospital livery, no Coast Guard colors. She watched it descend below the roofline and heard the pitch change as it came down. It landed in the parking lot of her building. She stood at the window for 3 seconds. Then she put her jacket on and went outside. There were 4 men. They came around the corner of the building in a formation that was technically casual and actually precise, the kind of movement that doesn't come from following rules but from so many years of practice that the rules have dissolved into instinct. 3 of them were in their 30s. One of them was older. He was the one who stopped when he saw her coming. He was somewhere in his early 50s, the kind of 50 that had been tested rather than merely aged. The lines in his face were the product of sun and squinting, and the compression of a jaw kept controlled for years in conditions that rewarded control. His hair was silver at the temples and cropped close, and he walked with a slight hesitation in his right knee that he was working to conceal and nearly succeeding. He looked at her for a moment. "Sloan Mercer," he said. "Yes." "Master Chief Garrett Drummond. I served with your father in Helmand." The morning air held the stillness of a moment before something changes. She was aware of it without knowing yet what it meant. "Our team medic lost 2 fingers this morning," he said. "Occupational incident, not combat, but he's out for at minimum 3 months. We have a deployment window in 94 hours, and we cannot go without medical coverage." He paused. "We need a medic." From behind Drummond's left shoulder, one of the younger men made a small sound that did not resolve into words. She looked at him briefly. He had the look of someone choosing consciously and with effort not to say what he was thinking. She looked back at Drummond. "I don't carry a weapon," she said. "I'm a nurse." "I know what you are," Drummond said. "I don't need a weapon. I need a medic." He reached into his jacket and took out an envelope. White commercial, the kind found in any office supply store. He held it out. She took it. Her name was on the front, in handwriting, and she recognized before she had consciously identified why she recognized it. Her brain processed it the way deeply familiar things are sometimes processed, not as information received, but as something remembered. Her father's handwriting. The postmark on the upper corner read, September 2012, 1 month before Helmand Province, 1 month before the notification officer knocked on her mother's door. She held the envelope without opening it. "He gave it to me the day before his last deployment," Drummond said. "He said if anything happened to him, I should hold on to it until I found the right moment." He paused. "I've been following your career for 4 months. I've been waiting until I was sure the moment was right." The man behind Drummond's shoulder could no longer contain himself. "Sir," he said, his voice held carefully between professional and something that wanted to be less professional. "With respect, she works in a hospital. She has never been in a combat environment." Drummond did not look at him. "Briggs, sir, go check the fuel levels." "Ah, sir, the pilot's already." "Go check them again." Briggs went. His footsteps on the asphalt had a deliberate quality. "You don't have to open that now," Drummond said. "I know," she said. She opened it anyway. The paper inside was one page written front and back in the same handwriting as the envelope. The ink had faded slightly over 12 years, and the creases from folding were deep. She read it the way she had been taught to read, things start to finish, without skipping, without deciding in advance what she was looking for. She stood in the parking lot of her apartment building in Chesapeake, with a Black Hawk helicopter behind her, and 3 men she had never met watching her with varying degrees of patience, and she read her father's last letter to her. She did not read it aloud. There are things that stay private. But when she folded it again the way it had been folded before and held it in both hands for a moment before putting it carefully in the inside pocket of her jacket, something in her face had settled. Not hardened, settled. The way a decision looks when it has been made, and you are no longer spending energy on the question. 94 hours, she said. 94 hours. What medical supplies? What surgical capability? Level 2 trauma kit, full pharmacological load, dedicated equipment bag. You configure it yourself based on what you want to carry. She nodded once. "I need to make a call first." "Take your time." She stepped away and called her mother. It was a 7-minute conversation. She would not reconstruct every word later, but she would remember its shape, the long pause after she explained what she was being asked to do, the sound of her mother breathing steadily, the sentence her mother finally said, which was not the sentence she had expected. When she came back, Drummond was standing exactly where she had left him. Briggs had returned from checking the fuel levels and was leaning against the building with his arms crossed in an expression of careful neutrality that was costing him visible effort. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." "I configure my own medical kit. I have full medical authority over any casualty, no overrides on my triage decisions in the field." Drummond considered for approximately 2 seconds. "Agreed." Briggs made a sound. Drummond looked at him. Briggs pressed his lips together and said nothing. The flight to Camp Lejeune took 40 minutes. Sloan sat on the starboard side and looked out at the North Carolina coast sliding beneath them, the sandbars and the shallow estuaries, and the long straight roads through the flatlands, and she thought about her father on a morning she would not describe to anyone. When they landed, she was introduced to the rest of the team in a briefing room inside a building with no external markings. Senior Chief Weston was 48 years old and had the stillness of a man who has been in rooms like this enough times that he no longer needs to fill space with movement or sound. He shook her hand without commentary and went back to reading the paper he was holding. Harlow was 28, slightly overbuilt, in the way of someone who had spent 2 years in the weight room compensating for something that weights couldn't fix. Farrell at 22 was the youngest, fresh from his first fleet assignment, not yet decided what kind of professional he was going to become, paying close attention to everything. None of them hostile. Professional skepticism, which in some ways requires more navigation than hostility, because it is patient and does not resolve on its own. Drummond gave her an hour with the medical supplies. She laid everything out on a folding table and went through it item by item, handling each piece individually, forming a physical memory of where it was and what it weighed and how it would come to hand in the dark. Tourniquet placement, chest seal position, hemostatic gauze, the surgical kit, IV lines, medications organized by category and labeled in her own shorthand. Harlow walked past the doorway twice. The third time he stopped. "You were Navy," he asked. "Corpsman, 4 years." He nodded, then more carefully. "Briggs doesn't mean anything personal. He had a field medic on a previous rotation who—" He stopped himself. "You don't have to explain him to me," Sloan said. "I know." He looked at her hands moving over the kit. "Do you get nervous before a deployment?" She thought about it genuinely. "I get focused. I'm not sure those are different things." He considered that. Then he nodded and walked away. She continued working. 40 minutes later, carrying the reconfigured medical bag across the tarmac, she stopped. She had not been paying attention to Drummond's conversation with Weston 10 feet away, but 2 words surfaced through her concentration. F.O.B. Dwyer. She kept walking. She did not change her expression. But something in her chest registered the name the way a bruise registers pressure, not a new pain, but the sudden reminder of an old one. She put the bag in the hold of the aircraft and stood at the sink in the head for a moment, with the water running, looking at her own face in the mirror. She looked like someone about to walk through a door that will not open again from the other side. She turned the water off and went back out. The helicopter was waiting. The team was boarding. As the Black Hawk lifted off and the North Carolina coastline tilted away beneath them, Sloan put her hand over the inside pocket of her jacket where her father's letter was folded. Not for comfort. More like a check. More like making sure something was still there. It was. She took her hand away and looked forward. 92 hours until deployment. She closed her eyes, slowed her breathing, and let the sound of the rotors become something steady and reliable the way she had learned to treat noise in the field. Not something to block out, but something to absorb into the background where it becomes less like chaos and more like weather. When she opened her eyes again, her face was calm. Not because she wasn't afraid, because she had decided. The mission briefing happened in a room with no windows at a forward operating location outside of Tegucigalpa that did not appear on any document Sloan had been given access to. The building was a converted agricultural warehouse, the kind that stores equipment during the dry season and sits empty the rest of the year. Someone had requisitioned it with the efficiency of people who are good at making temporary things look permanent. There were folding tables with satellite imagery printed on large format paper, topographic overlays, a whiteboard with 3 names on it in block letters, and beneath the names the word civilian written in a different hand. Drummond stood at the front and spoke for 11 minutes without consulting notes. The target was a telecommunications relay station in the eastern foothills of the Honduran interior, approximately 60 kilometers from the nearest population center of consequence. 3 civilian technicians contracted by a private infrastructure firm had been taken from the site 4 days earlier by a group that operated in the space between organized crime and private military, the kind of organization that does not have a flag or an ideology, only a fee structure. They were well-equipped, minimally disciplined, and they had chosen the relay station because its elevation gave them a natural defensive advantage, and because nobody who could do anything about it had moved fast enough in the first 72 hours. Now it was hour 96, and the window was narrowing. Sloan studied the topographic overlay while Drummond spoke. The station sat on a ridgeline at approximately 1,100 meters elevation, accessible by a single vehicle track from the south and by foot along two possible approaches from the north and northeast. The northern approach offered better concealment, but required crossing an exposed saddle at roughly 800 meters from the perimeter. The northeastern approach was longer, but stayed in tree cover until the final 200 meters. She noted the saddle. She noted the distance from the saddle to the ridgeline. She noted it again. She did not say anything. Briggs was across the table from her. He had developed over the past 2 days a consistent way of including her in operational conversations that managed to be technically courteous and substantively dismissive at the same time. He asked her questions about medical protocol with the careful specificity of someone who had already decided the answers were less important than the asking. She did not take it personally. She had been a Navy corpsman attached to infantry units for 4 years, and she understood the arithmetic of professional skepticism in close teams. Trust in those environments is not given. It is extended incrementally in small denominations against demonstrated performance. She was waiting for the opportunity to demonstrate. On the first day at the forward location, she identified a problem that had nothing to do with the mission and everything to do with the team's readiness to execute it. She noticed it at midday during a physical readiness assessment on the lower field. Harlow was last to finish the course, which was not unusual given that he had turned his right ankle slightly on the approach to the location and was compensating in his gait without advertising the fact. What was unusual was how he was compensating. The weight shift was loading his left knee at an angle that would, over the next 18 to 24 hours, produce enough inflammation in the lateral collateral ligament to meaningfully affect his mobility on uneven terrain. She did not interrupt the assessment. She waited until it was over. When Harlow walked past her toward the water station, she fell into step beside him. "Your right ankle," she said. He glanced at her. "It's fine. It's fine right now. Tomorrow morning on the northeastern approach, it won't be." He said nothing. "Sit down for 5 minutes," she said. He sat. She worked on his ankle with a compression wrap and a specific taping technique she had learned from a physical therapist on her second corpsman rotation, a figure-8 pattern that redistributed the load and corrected the mechanical error before it could compound. She told him to tell her if the feeling in his foot changed. He stood up and walked 20 meters and came back. "That's different," he said. "Weight through the center of the foot on incline. Stay off the lateral edge." He looked at her for a moment. "Thanks, Doc." She went back to her kit. Weston had been watching from a distance. When she passed him later in the corridor of the warehouse, he slowed fractionally and said without turning his head, "Good call on Harlow." She kept walking. "Thank you, Senior Chief." 2 sentences from Weston she understood was a significant transaction. He was the first one she had moved. On the second day, she had 3 interactions with Briggs that followed the same structural logic he created: distance. She declined to fill it with either protest or performance, and the distance remained. On the third interaction, during a final review of medical contingencies, he suggested she run through tourniquet application to confirm everyone was on the same page. The pleasantness with which he said it was the point of saying it. She picked up a cat tourniquet from the table, transferred it to her left hand, put her right arm behind her back, and applied the tourniquet to her own right thigh one-handed in 11 seconds. She pulled it to proper tension, locked the windlass, checked the position by feel, and set her arm down. She looked at Briggs. "We're on the same page," she said. Drummond said nothing. The quality of the silence in the room changed from what it had been a moment before. They moved out before 4 in the morning on the third day. The northeastern approach took 2 hours and 20 minutes at the pace Drummond set, not fast and not slow, but precisely the pace of people who have calculated the distance, the elevation change, and the required arrival window, and arrived at the speed that accounts for all of them simultaneously. The humidity was significant. The temperature at 1,100 meters was lower than the valley floor by 8 degrees, but the exertion of the ascent compensated for most of it, and by the time the tree cover began to thin, Sloane's base layer was wet through. She moved in the middle of the formation behind Weston and ahead of Harlow, paying attention to the ground the way she had been taught, not looking at her feet, but reading the terrain ahead, placing each step with deliberate efficiency, because twisted ankles happen in the dark on unfamiliar ground. And twisted ankles in this specific situation were a problem she would rather prevent than treat. The relay station resolved out of the pre-dawn dark slowly the way structures do at altitude, when there is no ambient light. A main building, 2 smaller outbuildings, a generator enclosure, the antenna array above the roofline, a single vehicle track from the south where 2 men were stationed at a barrier that was more territorial than tactical. Drummond hand-signaled the team into position. Sloane settled behind a dense stand of vegetation at the tree line and watched. The plan was clean in the way plans are clean before contact. Weston and Briggs would take the south approach to neutralize the entry point. Drummond would lead the breach of the main building with Harlow. Sloan would hold at a secondary position 30 meters back with line of sight to the entrance and radio contact throughout. It stayed clean for the first 6 minutes. The breach went without incident. Drummond's team entered the main building and the radio carried controlled minimal transmissions. 3 hostages confirmed main floor rear room, 2 armed guards compliant. She heard the compressed sounds from the south position that meant the entry point was resolved. Then the shot came from the high ground to the northwest. She did not need anyone to tell her what it meant. The angle, the sound arriving a fraction after the impact, the distance implied by that fraction. She looked northwest and up and identified the ridgeline. She estimated the distance at somewhere between 800 and 850 meters. Drummond's voice on the radio, controlled but compressed. Sniper northwest ridge, I am static. Harlow, extract the package. Briggs northwest, can you reposition? Negative, sir. Pin at the south entry. Then Harlow's voice, and the quality of it was wrong. I'm hit, shoulder. Still mobile, but Harlow's status on the package. Package is contained, I need 30 seconds. Sloan was moving before she had consciously decided to move. She came out of the tree line at a low run and reached the position where the team's long gun had been staged. The Barrett M8-2A1 set on its bipod on a flat piece of ground behind a rock formation that Drummond had selected during the planning session for exactly this kind of contingency. She went down behind it. Briggs came on the radio. Doc, do not dock. What are you doing? Drummond's voice very steady. Briggs. Sir, she has never. Briggs, hold the south. A pause. In that pause was everything Briggs had been carrying since the parking lot in Virginia. The skepticism, the professional concern, the genuine worry that sat beneath both of those things and was perhaps more honest than either. Sir, he said. He went quiet. Sloan put her eye to the scope. The Barrett M8-2A1 is 30 inches from grip to muzzle, weighs 30 pounds, and fires a .50 caliber round that carries enough energy at 800 meters to make the concept of cover largely theoretical. The recoil from a cold position taken by a body that has been moving for 2.5 hours up a mountain in high humidity is a physical event that requires anticipation and management rather than resistance. Her father had introduced her to the Barrett when she was 16. He had driven her to a long-range range outside of Quantico on a Saturday in October and spent 40 minutes explaining the physics before he let her touch the rifle. Then he had watched her shoot for 3 hours without saying much beyond technical corrections. At the end of the 3 hours, he had packed up the truck and at a red light on Route 1 had said without preamble, "You've got the instinct. The math just needs time." The math needed 2 more years. By the time she was 18, it was no longer something she thought about. It was something she did. She breathed in, held it partway, read the ridgeline. The sniper was in a depression behind a rocky outcropping at approximately 820 meters. She could not see the shooter. She was looking for the position, which is a different thing and requires different patience. She saw the thermal bloom of the rifle barrel against the cool rock a half second before the shooter adjusted position. She exhaled slowly. She let her heart rate come down. She placed the crosshairs. She squeezed. The round went high by an estimated 8 inches. She knew it the moment the trigger broke. Not a dramatic wrongness, a fractional misalignment between intention and execution, the kind that comes from cold muscles and high altitude, and 2 hours of physical exertion on a body that has not yet fully recalibrated. 8 inches at 820 meters. She cycled the bolt. She did not touch the scope. She adjusted herself. Breathing, heart rate, position. She resettled her hold, accounting for what the first shot had told her about the wind at that distance. She waited 2 seconds. Anyone who has just been missed at close distance moves in 2 seconds. He moved left. She was already there. The second round landed. The ridgeline went quiet. There is a silence that falls over a group of people who have just watched something they did not expect to be possible. Not the silence of shock exactly. The silence of a mental model being revised in real time against evidence that the previous model cannot accommodate. Harlow's voice came first on the radio. Northwest Ridge is clear. Then nothing for a moment. Then Briggs in a voice she had not heard from him before. Who made that shot? Not a question. The different kind of not a question. Drummond came out of the main building with 3 hostages moving ahead of him and crossed to her position with the fast, purposeful stride of someone who has completed one problem and is already calculating the next. He looked at the ridgeline. He looked at the Barrett. He looked at her. She was already checking the rifle to safe and getting to her feet. Shoulder, he said, it's functional. I'm going to need to make that determination when we're out of the open. He looked at her for another half second. Then he nodded once. Harlow reached her first. His right shoulder had taken a graze. The round had taken fabric and skin along the outer deltoid without striking the underlying structure. And he had been right that he was still mobile, though the way he was holding his arm told her things about the pain that his expression was not telling her. She put her hand on his back and moved him toward the tree line, and he led her, which was itself a form of information. Briggs fell in on her left side as they moved. He said nothing, but he positioned himself between her and the southern end of the building, and she noted this. In the tree cover with three disoriented civilians sitting on the ground, slowly understanding that the worst of it was over. Sloan worked on Harlow's shoulder with the focused economy of someone whose emotional response to the situation has been placed in a dedicated compartment and will remain there until the work is done. The wound was clean. She irrigated it, applied hemostatic gauze, dressed it properly. She checked his neurovascular status, capillary refill, sensation, grip strength, and found it intact. She told him what she was doing in the specific declarative way she had developed over 4 years with the Navy, the style of communication that keeps a patient's nervous system oriented and cooperative. Short sentences, present tense, no speculation. Drummond crouched beside her while she worked and said quietly, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "My father." He was quiet for a moment. "The first shot?" "Yes." "You adjusted?" "Yes." He looked at her hands moving over Harlow's shoulder with the same quality of efficiency they had moved over the kit at Camp Lejeune. "What was your longest confirmed practice shot?" 1,420 meters, once, under good conditions. She did not look up. This was not good conditions. She was almost finished with Harlow when one of the hostages spoke. He was the oldest of the three, somewhere in his late 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to institutional authority. He had said very little since being brought out of the building. His face in the blue pre-dawn light was the face of a man doing internal accounting. He was looking at Sloan, not at her hands, at her face, and he remembered tongue. "Mercer," he said. She looked up. His expression had shifted. Something in the set of his jaw that had been controlled became less controlled. He looked for a moment like a man who has stepped onto ground he did not realize was unstable. "Are you Cole Mercer's daughter?" The pre-dawn sounds of the eastern Honduran foothills did the work that silence would have done. Insects, wind moving through high grass at the tree line. "Yes," she said. He looked at the ground between them. Something moved across his face that was not easy to classify, the quality of a man encountering a consequence he has been carrying for a long time. "My name is Ashford," he said. "Lieutenant Colonel James Ashford, Naval Medical Command attached to administrative oversight." He paused. "I signed your separation notice." She did not change her expression. She looked at him for a moment with the same steadiness with which she looked at everything, and then she looked back at Harlow's shoulder and made the final adjustment to the dressing. "I know," she said. Ashford said nothing. "Stay hydrated," she told him and handed him a water bottle. Drummond found her 20 minutes later, sitting on a rock at the edge of the tree cover with her jacket off, examining her left shoulder in the gray early light. A graze 4 inches through the outer trapezius, not deep, but bleeding steadily into her shirt for the past half hour. She was holding a piece of gauze against it with her right hand, doing the awkward, one-handed inventory of a wound in a place she cannot easily see. He sat down beside her and took the gauze from her hand. "Through and through," he said. "Yes." "You should have said something." It didn't affect the shot. He held the gauze in place with the right amount of pressure and was quiet for a moment. Behind them, Weston was organizing the exfiltration with the low-friction efficiency of someone who has done this many times. "I need to tell you something," Drummond said. She waited. He kept the pressure on her shoulder and looked out at the ridgeline where the dawn was beginning to separate sky from rock. "Your father didn't die the way it's written in the notification," he said. He took a round to the upper thigh during a vehicle interdiction. Femoral artery, not a large wound. The kind that with immediate and correct treatment is survivable the majority of the time. He paused. There was no combat medic at FOB Dwyer that morning. The unit medic had been medevaced the previous day. The replacement had not yet arrived. The men with your father did everything they could. It wasn't enough. The knowledge wasn't there. He stopped. He was gone in under 4 minutes. Sloane's jaw tightened. She made a deliberate choice to keep looking at the ridgeline. 4 minutes, she said. 4 minutes. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. The breath was controlled. Everything else for that moment was not, But the breath was, and the breath was what mattered right now. "That's why you came to find me," she said. "Partly," he said, "and because he asked me to." She thought about her father on the day he wrote the letter, about him knowing with the practical foresight of a man who had done 3 previous deployments that he might not come back from the fourth, and choosing not to insulate her from that knowledge but to invest it in her instead. The shooting, the medicine, the discipline, all of it arranged in advance by a man who understood that the best thing you can leave someone is not safety, but capability. She did not cry. The grief was present. She had learned long ago that grief does not resolve, only changes shape, but it was not what she was feeling most in that moment. What she was feeling most was something harder than grief and quieter than anger, something that needed a direction. She put her jacket back on. The second shooter appeared 17 minutes into the exfiltration. The team was 200 meters into the tree cover on the northeastern slope, moving in the fast, loose formation of an extraction rather than the careful, patient formation of an approach. The round came from the east, not the ridge line, a different elevated position, lower and closer. A secondary element placed separately watching the approach routes patient enough to wait until the most exposed moment. The round struck a tree 6 inches from Drummond's head, and the team went flat without a command, a single simultaneous dissolution into the ground. Weston's voice came through the earpiece flat and precise. 1,150 meters eastern slope near the tree line at the ridge break. Sloan was already reading the terrain. The eastern position was higher than the western ridge line by approximately 50 meters. The angle was difficult, not impossible, but complicated by the elevation differential and the wind that had come up in the past 20 minutes as the sun began to warm the valley floor and thermal dynamics started moving air upslope. She estimated 14 knots from the southwest. She felt it on her face. She calculated. The Barrett was with Drummond 10 meters to her left. He had carried it out of the station compound after she set it down. He was already pushing it toward her. She pulled it across to her position. She went behind a fallen tree that gave her the angle she needed. She settled the bipod, put her eye to the scope. The shoulder was telling her things. Not overwhelming things. The tissue damage was muscular, not structural, but the persistent message a body sends when it has been asked to do something it has been recently damaged doing. She noted the message. She filed it in the dedicated compartment. 14 knots southwest. Elevation differential, 50 meters. Distance, 1,150 meters. She walked the math through the part of her brain where the math lived, the part her father had built over 8 years of Saturday mornings and October afternoons in long, slow, careful conversations about wind and gravity and patience. She breathed in. Let half of it out. Let her heart rate reach the bottom of its cycle. She squeezed once. The eastern slope went quiet. Drummond's voice on the radio was flat and factual. Eastern position clear. Resume extraction, double time. The team rose from the ground and moved. Briggs came past her and took the Barrett from her hands without stopping because they were moving and she needed both hands free for the terrain. He took the rifle and for a fraction of a moment their eyes met, and in that fraction she saw something that had not been there before. Not apology, not yet, but the beginning of something. A model being revised. He looked forward and kept moving. Weston fell in on her right side as the formation picked up pace through the trees, the dawn going gold ahead of them. He did not say anything for a full minute. Then, without looking at her, "Your father would have said the second shot was unnecessary. Too much wind." She kept her eyes on the terrain ahead. "My father would have been right." Weston almost smiled. She saw it in her peripheral vision. It lasted 1 second. They ran. The sun came fully over the eastern peaks, and the shadow of the mountain fell away behind them, and the air went warm and gold the way mornings do at altitude when the night has been cold and the day is going to be something entirely different. She ran with the medical kit on her back and her left shoulder, making its steady case for attention, and her heart rate doing exactly what she needed it to do. She put one foot in front of the other on the descending slope of a mountain in a country she had never been to before, and she thought about a man dying in the dust of Helmand Province, with a wound that 4 minutes of the right knowledge could have stopped. She thought about the letter in her jacket pocket. She thought about her father's voice in the dark of a Virginia morning running ahead of her, never slowing down, always staying close enough that she didn't fall behind. She ran faster. They reached the vehicles at 6:43 in the morning. The extraction point was a shallow ravine 2 kilometers below the relay station, where the northeastern trail met a dirt access road that satellite imagery had identified as usable in dry conditions. It was dry. Two trucks were where Weston had staged them the night before, covered in vegetation that matched the surrounding scrub, invisible from above, unless you were looking for them and knew what looking looked like. The team came down the last slope in a controlled descent, the hostages in the middle, everyone moving with the specific urgency of people who are close to the end of a thing and do not intend to lose it now. Sloane was on the right flank. Her left shoulder was talking to her in the persistent monotone of tissue damage that has not yet had the chance to stiffen manageable if you give it no additional attention. She was giving it no additional attention. Harlow was moving well ahead of her, which was something given the ankle and the dressed shoulder. His mechanics were within acceptable parameters, loading through the center of the foot the way she had told him, the tape holding. He would need imaging and proper surgical attention when they were back. But he was moving and he was controlled, and those were the two things that mattered in this moment. Ashford was 10 meters ahead, moving with the grim efficiency of a man who has processed fear and is operating on the far side of it. He would make it to the vehicles in approximately 90 seconds. That was when Sloane heard the sound she had not expected to hear. Not a shot, not yet. A shift in the quality of the air above the ravine, a change in how the morning light fell on the eastern wall, a compression of the silence that meant something was disturbing it from a direction they had not accounted for. She had 2 seconds to process it. She used both of them. The position was above the ravine on the eastern wall, at approximately the point where the trail had crossed a natural rock shelf before descending the final grade. Someone had moved during the night. Not part of the group at the relay station, a secondary element placed separately watching the approach routes for exactly this kind of extraction. Patient, silent, waiting until the most expensive moment. The most exposed ground in the ravine was the final 20 meters to the vehicles where the vegetation used to conceal the trucks had eliminated any remaining concealment for the team. Harlow was 3 steps into it. The shot came from above and east. A single round and it was not a miss. It struck Harlow in the upper left thigh, slightly medial, at a downward angle consistent with a position 8 to 10 meters above the ravine floor. He went down with a hard exhalation, the kind the body produces when it receives information faster than the voice can organize a response, and then he was on the ground with his left hand pressing instinctively at the wound and his right hand still holding his weapon, because training is more durable than pain. Sloane covered the distance between them in 6 steps. Not running the way a person runs on adrenaline, but running the controlled fast way of someone who has calculated the distance and determined that the pace required is this pace and not any other. She went down beside him, converting her forward momentum into the drop and settle of someone going to ground, and she had the cat tourniquet out of her left hip pocket before she was fully stopped. She saw the blood. It was the specific color and volume and speed of arterial bleeding, and it confirmed what the angle of entry and the location of impact had already told her. The femoral artery. The one that kills you in 3 minutes. The one that had killed her father on a morning in Afghanistan, while men who loved him watched and did not have what they needed to stop it. She had 9 seconds before the blood loss began compounding in ways that would take the decision out of her hands. She had the tourniquet around his thigh in oint. Her right hand cinched the windlass, 1 rotation 2, the resistance increasing as the compression built. Harlow was making a sound somewhere between a groan and a word, and she talked over it without softening her voice, because softening it would not help him, and he needed information more than comfort. Femoral. Tourniquet is on. You are going to be fine. Do not move your left leg. His eyes found hers. Don't let me die, Doc. She tightened the windlass a final increment and locked it. Nobody dies today, she said. Then she looked up. The shooter on the eastern wall was moving. She could see the silhouette against the morning sky repositioning along the rock shelf, shifting the angle to account for the fact that most of the team had gone flat when Harlow went down. The repositioning meant a brief window during which the angle was degraded. She estimated 4 seconds. The Barrett was with Briggs, who had taken it during the exfil and was currently behind a natural rock buttress at the ravine mouth, 15 meters to her left, with a line of sight to the eastern wall that she did not have from her current position. She kept her right hand on the tourniquet windlass. She turned her head toward Briggs and did the calculation in 1 second, his position, the angle, the window, the distance she estimated at 680 meters, given the traverse from the relay station and the repositioning she had just observed. Briggs, she said, her voice carried the distance. Not loud, flat and direct. He was already looking at her. Eastern wall. He moved left from the shelf 20 feet above the gap in the rock face. She did not look away from the eastern wall. 680 approximately. Wind is dropping. He'll settle in 4 seconds. I don't have the angle from here. Come up 6 inches on your position. The gap in the rock face is your reference. A pause of 1 second. In that second, Briggs was doing what any competent shooter does when receiving targeting information, running the numbers against his own read of the terrain, checking the geometry, deciding how much weight to put on the source. He adjusted his position. She heard gravel compress under a boot shift. I see the gap, he said. Count of 3 from now. She watched the eastern wall. The figure had settled. She could see the stillness of a shooter acquiring a target. Her right hand stayed locked on the windlass. 3, she said. The morning held its breath. 2. Harlow's hand found her forearm. She felt the grip. 1. The Barrett spoke once. The eastern wall did not move again. Sloan looked down at Harlow. His color was not good, but it was not getting worse, which meant the tourniquet was doing its work. She checked his pulse at the wrist, rapid, thready, but present. She checked the skin below the tourniquet for temperature. She checked the wound site for any additional bleeding the tourniquet might not have fully controlled. She found none. He was looking at her with the expression from the cold open now resolved into something she could read completely. Not disbelief anymore. Something simpler and more durable. The expression of a man who has been told he is going to be fine by someone whose word on the subject he has decided to trust entirely. You did that with one hand, he said. The other hand was directing Briggs, she said. He almost laughed. It came out as a sound adjacent to a laugh, abbreviated by the pain and the adrenaline, but unmistakably something on the spectrum of a human being finding something genuinely worth the effort. She noted this as a positive clinical indicator and began the secondary assessment. It took 11 minutes to get everyone into the vehicles and begin the drive out of the ravine. Harlow was in the rear of the first truck on a makeshift litter constructed from 2 tactical vests and a cargo strap, his leg elevated, and the tourniquet marked with the time of application in black marker on his skin the way it is supposed to be done and is frequently not done in the chaos of field casualties. Ashford sat beside him without being asked and said nothing, which was exactly what was needed. Drummond drove the first vehicle. Sloan sat in the passenger seat with her kit open in her lap, monitoring Harlow through the gap in the seats, rechecking the timeline for arterial tourniquets against the anticipated drive to the forward location. Approximately 45 minutes of drive time. The tourniquet had been on for 11 minutes. The safe window for arterial tourniquet without vascular compromise was longer than that, but not indefinitely longer, and the priority was getting Harlow to a stable environment where she could begin the next phase of treatment. She told Drummond the timeline without being asked. He adjusted his speed. At the forward location, she spent 2 hours doing the work that the field had not given her the conditions to do properly. She converted the cleared briefing table into a treatment surface and reassessed Harlow from the tourniquet site upward, the methodical head-to-toe evaluation that becomes possible when you are no longer moving and the ground is not actively hostile. She removed the tourniquet in controlled increments, monitoring for bleeding, managing the wound with proper irrigation and packing, and a dressing that would hold until they reached a surgical facility. She redressed his shoulder. She started an IV for fluid resuscitation and hung the bag on the improvised hook that Weston had fashioned from a length of paracord in a ceiling fixture without her asking him to. She worked in the focused silence she had learned in the Navy, not cold, not distant, but completely present in the work, because complete presence is what the work requires, and anything less is something you will account for later. When she finished, she wrote her clinical notes on a legal pad, documenting every intervention with the time and the rationale and the patient's status at each decision point. Not a military requirement in this context. She did it because she had always done it, and because the habit was too deeply grooved to abandon, and because documentation when it matters is the difference between accountability and ambiguity. She was writing the last line when Ashford appeared in the doorway. He was cleaned up and had been given dry clothes from the team's supply stores, and he looked more like the man implied by his rank, the posture restored, the institutional bearings settled back into place. But he stood in the doorway rather than entering, and he waited until she looked up before he spoke. How is he asked. Stable. He needs a surgical facility for proper repair, but the immediate risk is controlled. Ashford nodded. He looked at her clinical notes in the IV bag and the dressing on Harlow's thigh, and she could see him revising a previous assessment against new information. I want to explain the termination, he said. You don't have to. I want to. He came into the room and stood on the opposite side of the table. The report you filed on Calloway was correct. I believed that when I received it. But Calloway has relationships in the command structure that I did not have the standing to override without a formal investigation, And a formal investigation takes time and generates exposure for the institution, and there are people in the institution who consider that kind of exposure to be the problem rather than the underlying conduct. He paused. None of that is an explanation. I know it isn't. I'm telling you the context, not the justification. Leonard Doyle's wife brought him a magazine every day, she said, because of a dosage error that should have been caught. Yes. A review process doesn't give her husband back. No, he said, it doesn't. She looked at her clinical notes. Then she looked back up. The report I filed is still on record. Yes. Then the review process has what it needs. That's all I ever wanted. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice that was not institutional and not authoritative, and was simply the voice of a man saying something he had decided to say. Drummond's team pulled me out of that building this morning. The man who made sure that was possible is in that litter, and you put the tourniquet on him one-handed while telling Briggs where to shoot. He stopped. I'll make sure the termination is addressed. You have my word. She did not say thank you. She looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded once and looked back at her patient. He left the room. In the late afternoon, when Harlow was sleeping, and the forward location had settled into the specific quiet of a team in the aftermath of an operation, the decompression that is not relaxation, but the slow return of normal respiration after extended altitude, Drummond found her sitting outside the warehouse on an overturned fuel drum, watching the sun go down over the Honduran Valley. He sat on the ground beside the drum without ceremony, the way a man sits when the formality of rank is temporarily beside the point. He had a folder. After action report, he said, I'm recommending the creation of a new designation within the team's medical support structure, Integrated Combat Medic. He held the folder out. I'd like you to read what I wrote before I submit it. She took it and read it. 2 pages single-spaced, written in the economical language of military reporting that communicates most through what it chooses to include. It described the events of the past 22 hours in precise operational terms, and in those terms, it named with documentation what she had done and when and under what conditions she had done it. She read it twice. You mentioned the first shot, she said. I mentioned both shots. The first one missed. The first one established distance and wind conditions under adverse circumstances and was followed immediately by a successful shot at 820 meters from a cold position after a 2.5-hour mountain ascent. He looked at her. In my experience, people who never miss haven't been shooting at hard enough targets. She handed the folder back. The designation, she said. What does it mean in practice? It means you have formal standing to operate as a combat medic with advanced engagement authority. It means when we need both a medic and a shooter, we have a structure that covers someone who is both. It means the next time there's a FOB Dwyer with no medic on station, there's a framework that accounts for that. He paused. It means your father's death has a place to become something forward-facing instead of something that just sits in a file marked KYA. The valley below them was going blue and orange in the layered way of tropical highlands at dusk. She looked at it for a moment. I need to call my mother, she said. Comms room. Sat phone in the corner where the signal is strongest. She found it. The conversation lasted 8 minutes, and she would not reconstruct every word later, but she would remember its shape, her mother's voice, when she heard Sloane's steady and carrying the particular weight of a military family's relationship with phone calls always weighted with the knowledge of the calls that don't come. She told her mother she was safe. She told her what she could tell her, which was not everything, but was enough. And near the end, in the pause before goodbye, she said, Mom, Dad's letter. I think I finally understand what he was doing. All those years. Her mother was quiet. He was building something, Sloane said. He was building it in me, so it would still be there when it was needed. I know, her mother said. He knew he might not always be there to give it, so he made sure you were carrying it. She stood in the comms room for a moment after the call ended, holding the sat phone. Outside the window, the last light was fading over the valley. Somewhere in the warehouse behind her, Harlow was sleeping. Briggs was running a function check on his weapon with the attention of a man who has been given something to think about. Weston was making coffee with the patience and seriousness that Weston applied to everything. She set the phone down. She went to find the others. Briggs was at the weapons table. He had finished the function check and was running a cloth over the Barrett's receiver with the meditative focus of someone doing one thing and thinking about another. He heard her come in and did not look up immediately. He needed the extra second. Then he looked up. He held her gaze longer than he would have held it 3 days ago. The angle from my position on the eastern wall, he said. You were right. I didn't see it until you said where to look. Your position was correct for the geometry. You just needed the reference point. You had the reference point because you were watching the whole wall. He set the cloth down. While you were putting a tourniquet on Harlow. She said nothing. With one hand, he said, the other hand was directing you. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the relative of one. I owe you an apology, he said. The parking lot in Virginia, the flight down, the first 2 days here, all of it. He looked directly at her. I had a medic on a previous rotation who missed something she should have caught, and a man almost died, and I did not handle the adjustment well when Drummond told me who was coming. He paused. Still, it was wrong. Buy me coffee when we're back, she said. We'll call it even. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded and picked the cloth back up. Mercer, she stopped. The second shot, 1150. Moving wounded 14 knot crosswind. He paused. Your father would have been proud. She kept looking at the door for a moment. He would have told me the wind correction was 2 minutes too conservative. Was it? She thought about it honestly. Probably. She went back out. Weston gave her the patch that evening. He did it the way Weston did most things, without preamble, without accompanying explanation in the space between one task and the next, so that it was accomplished before you had fully registered that it had begun. He came and sat across from her at the briefing table where she was updating her notes and placed an object on the table between them and slid it toward her. A Force Recon patch. Marine Corps, the eagle and anchor and globe worn to the point where the embroidered edges had softened, the backing faded from whatever original color it had been. The kind of worn that takes years and means the object has been somewhere important. She looked at it without touching it. Drummond's been carrying it since Hellman, Weston said. He told me your father would have wanted it given at the right time. He looked at the patch and then at her. I have served with a lot of people in a lot of places. I have never seen what you did this morning done by anyone under any conditions with the same degree of control. Your father's patch belongs with his work. He paused. His work is you. She looked at the patch for a long time. Then she picked it up and held it in both hands and felt the weight of it. Not a physical weight, it was paper thin and almost nothing but the other kind. The kind that accumulates over years and does not diminish with use. She closed her hand around it. Weston nodded once and stood up and went back to what he was doing. 3 weeks before she stood in front of her first class at Bethesda, she received a letter on official Naval Medical Command letterhead. She read it twice, folded it, and placed it in the same drawer where she kept her father's letter. It was signed by Vice Admiral Corbin, Deputy Commander, Naval Medical Command. The language was formal and institutional and ran to 3 paragraphs that said, in the compression of official correspondence, the following, that an independent review of the incident report filed by Nurse Sloan Mercer on February 14th had been completed, that the findings of the review supported the substance of the report in full, that the separation action initiated in March had been reviewed and determined to be procedurally improper and substantively without merit, that the separation was hereby withdrawn and expunged from her service record effective immediately. The 3rd paragraph noted that Dr. Calloway had been placed on administrative leave pending further proceedings and that the case of Leonard Doyle had been referred to the hospital's Patient Safety Board for formal review. She thought about Patricia Doyle when she read that paragraph. Patricia, who brought a magazine every day to a man who would have come home if the right report had reached the right desk at the right time. The review would not give her husband back. But it would mean that what happened to him was on record, that it would be accounted for, that the quiet errors, the ones that look like rounding issues on paper and kill like blades, would be harder to bury going forward. It was not justice in the way the word is used when people want things to feel finished. It was the other kind, the kind that takes longer and costs more and looks like a letter on official stationery and matters more than it looks like it does. She put it in the drawer with her father's letter and went back to building her curriculum. 6 months after the morning in Honduras. The room held 18 people and Sloan stood at the front of it and felt for the first time in her professional life that she was in exactly the right room at exactly the right time for exactly the reason she was supposed to be there. The Naval Medical Center at Bethesda had given her a classroom on the 2nd floor of the training annex. Long tables adjustable, lighting a whiteboard that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. On the whiteboard, she had written 3 things: integrate, adapt, bring them home. The 18 Navy corpsmen in the seats ranged in age from 21 to 29. They had come from various units in various specialties, and they all had in common the quality of people who had been told they were about to learn something they hadn't been taught before and were working to conceal their varying degrees of skepticism. She recognized the skepticism. She had stopped finding it an obstacle. Skepticism, her father had told her on a cold November evening, is just respect that hasn't been earned yet. She had time. Farrell was in the front row. He was 22, fresh from his first fleet assignment, not yet decided what kind of professional he was going to become, but paying close attention to the options. He had taken good notes at the previous 2 sessions and asked questions that were better than they needed to be. She had told him this once briefly, in the way she told people things directly and without embellishment. Harlow was in the room too. Not as a student. He had come at his own request to speak to the class for 15 minutes at the end of the session in the way that people who have been on the other end of a skill set sometimes want to speak about it. He was walking well. The femoral repair had been clean, the recovery thorough, and the physiotherapy had done its work. He sat in the back row with his arms crossed in the easy patience of a man who has learned from the most direct possible experience to trust the person at the front of the room. He had told the review board what he had seen on a mountainside in Honduras. He had told them with the plain directness of a man reporting facts, no embellishment required, because the facts were sufficient. He had not done it for her. He had done it because it was the accurate account and because accurate accounts matter. But when she had called him to tell him about the letter from Vice Admiral Corbin, he had been quiet for a moment and then said simply, "Good." She understood what that word was carrying. It was carrying quite a lot. She looked at the 18 faces looking back at her. "The course is called Integrated Combat Medicine," she said. "You've read the curriculum. You know what we're covering over the next 6 weeks. I want to start by telling you what this course is not." She paused. "It is not about turning medics into soldiers. It is not about turning soldiers into medics. It is about understanding that in the field when it matters, those are not always 2 separate jobs, and the person who can move between them in the same 4 minutes is the person who saves the most lives." She let that sit. "The foundation of this course is a principle I did not invent. My father taught it to me when I was 12 years old, and I have spent the last 6 months building a curriculum around it." She turned to the whiteboard and wrote below the 3 words already there: "Heal when you can, fight when you must." It sounds simple. Most true things do. She turned back to the class. "Let's get to work." That evening, she drove back to her apartment in Chesapeake. She had moved since coming back from Honduras, not far a better space, one she had made slightly less bare than the previous one, a concession to the idea of staying. There was a photograph on the kitchen table that had previously lived in a locker. Her father in desert utilities, squinting into the sun, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. She had found a frame for it in Bethesda and brought it home and set it on the table where she could see it from the kitchen while she made coffee. The Force Recon patch was in a small frame on the wall above the table. Weston had suggested the framing. She had told him it seemed formal. He had said that formal was appropriate for things that had earned it. She made coffee and sat at the table with her legal pad and wrote the notes for the next session. Outside her window, Chesapeake was dark and quiet in the particular way of early spring evenings when the weather has not yet decided what it wants to be. The river was out there somewhere beyond the buildings, the same river she had run along the morning. Everything changed, the same waterfront and dry docks and long flat road parallel to the water. She was halfway through the second page when her phone lit up. Drummond. She looked at it for a moment and then answered. "How was the first session?" 18 students. Good questions. Farrell is going to be exceptional. I heard Harlow was there. He's protective," she said. "He doesn't want to be, but he is." Drummond was quiet for a moment. She could hear in the background what she identified as a military transport environment, the pressurized quiet of a C-130 or similar, the sub-frequency hum that becomes familiar after enough hours in the air. "I'm sending you a briefing document," he said. "There's a situation developing in the Northern Cape. Nothing immediate. 4 to 6 weeks out." She looked at the photograph on the table, her father squinting into the sun. One hand raised against the glare, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. "I'll read it tonight," she said. "Get some sleep first." "I'll read it tonight," she said again. And she heard him almost not quite smile in the same way that Weston almost not quite smiled, the economy of expression of a certain kind of man who has learned that most of what needs to be communicated does not require volume. "Briefing at 0800 when I'm back," he said. "I'll be there," she said. She set the phone down and looked at the legal pad and the photograph and the patch in its frame. And she thought about her father on a cold November tailgate when she was 12 years old, and about a woman named Patricia, who once brought magazines to a man she loved, and about a ridge in Honduras, going quiet in the morning light, and about 18 corpsmen who were going to learn something in the next 6 weeks that might one day buy someone 4 minutes they would not otherwise have had. She thought about FOB Dwyer and 4 minutes and a wound that should not have been unsurvivable. She picked up her pen and finished her notes. Outside, Chesapeake held the stillness of a night that has not yet decided what the morning is going to require. But she had learned over the course of 26 years in the months since that the morning always requires something. The question was never whether you were going to be called. The question was whether you were going to be ready. She put the cap back on her pen. She looked at her father's photograph one more time. She was ready.